The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their mechanical pulse steady as a metronome. Natalie Hayes pushed through the emergency department doors at St. Michael's Hospital at 6:44 a.m. on a Tuesday, her badge already clipped to the pocket of her scrubs, her movements economical and precise. She did not hurry. She did not pause. She moved through the chaos of the morning shift like someone who had learned long ago that controlled motion preserved energy for the moments that would demand everything. The smell hit first, antiseptic layered over stale coffee, the particular staleness of a building that had been recycled and recooled 1,000 times. Her shoes, worn combat boots with the laces tied in a specific manner that no one had yet questioned, clicked against the tile with a rhythm that belonged to her alone. 6 months at St. Michael's and she had perfected the art of being present without being seen. The Colorado Springs COVID ward did not need spectacle. It needed competence, and competence had a way of going unnoticed when it arrived quietly. Her assignment had come through channels that existed in the spaces between official channels. A nurse with minimal credentials, just enough to pass the licensing board, just enough to slip into the hospital's system like a key into a lock that had been waiting for her shape. Natalie Hayes. The name was real. Everything else had been built around it like water around a stone. She had served as a captain in the Air Force Medical Corps for 12 years, 3 tours in Baghdad, 2 Purple Hearts earned in places her official file would never mention. The classified security clearance buried deep in her credentialing database was real too, though her immediate supervisor, a harried charge nurse named Patricia with 17 years of ward experience, had no way of knowing what those clearance levels meant. No way of knowing that Natalie had not come to St. Michael's to build a nursing career. She had come because someone in the hospital was stealing. The medical supply theft ring operated with the precision of a military unit, which meant it had military connections. What had started as an audit discrepancy, $340,000 in missing pharmaceuticals and equipment over 4 months, had escalated into a national security concern when the stolen inventory included thermoelectric components used in missile guidance systems. The Pentagon did not publicize these kinds of breaches. Instead, they quietly placed someone inside. Someone who could listen. Someone who could watch. Someone whose presence would be so unremarkable that people would speak freely around her, the way they always did around people they perceived as beneath their notice. Natalie understood how that worked. She had learned it in Baghdad, in a trauma tent where doctors spoke about life and death while nurses gathered fours and blood products, invisible as the antiseptic that clung to everything. Doctors saw the uniform rank. They did not see the hands that had packed wounds and kept people alive on tables that had no margin for error. They did not see that a person could be both silent and essential, could hold something together while everyone else was falling apart. The ICU ward sprawled across the 3rd floor in a controlled grid of glass-fronted rooms and monitor stations. Each bay held its own small universe of beeping and hissing machines, the mechanical respiration of the critically ill. Natalie moved between them with the kind of spatial awareness that came from training, from muscle memory that had learned where every exit was before she ever clocked in on her first shift. She checked her faded unit patch sewn deep inside her jacket lining, not for luck, but for grounding. The patch had survived 2 wars. It would survive this too. The day shift supervisor, Margaret, barely glanced up from her computer. Beds 12, 14, and 16 need vitals at the top of the hour. The attending on rounds is Dr. Mercer. She paused, selecting words. Particular. Chart everything in detail. Natalie nodded. She had already read Dr. Mercer's file. 46 years old. Medical degree from Johns Hopkins. Orthopedic background, though he had pivoted to critical care administration 5 years ago, a lateral move that suggested office politics rather than clinical passion. His evaluations were technically competent and interpersonally brutal. He had a history of conflict with nursing staff, particularly those who stepped outside clearly defined hierarchies. He was also connected to the hospital supply chain oversight committee, which meant he had access to inventory records and authorization codes. Which meant he was a person Natalie needed to understand. She completed her first rounds in the measured cadence of competent care. Vitals logged. Lines checked. Notes recorded in the sparse clinical style that Margaret had instructed her to use: clear, accurate, minimal. The kind of charting that left no room for interpretation because it did not attempt any. Natalie had been trained in trauma documentation, where clarity could determine whether a patient lived or died. The irony of being told that her accurate notes were too minimal was not lost on her, though her expression did not register it. The morning routine progressed into the quiet rhythm of the midshift. Natalie moved between rooms and the central station, her hand steady as she ran saline lines and adjusted ventilator settings. Around 11:13 a.m., the doors to the ICU opened with the particular authority that came from white coat and title. Dr. Mercer entered with 2 residents trailing behind him like planets orbiting a sun that believed itself the center of the galaxy. He was taller than his file photograph suggested, with the kind of posture that came from never having questioned whether he belonged in a room. His eyes moved across the ward with the assessment of someone cataloging what was wrong rather than acknowledging what was working. When his gaze landed on Natalie, it did not settle. It passed across her the way light passes through glass, acknowledging the surface, detecting nothing significant below. The resident stopped at bed 12. Mercer pulled the chart and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Who documented this?" "I did," Natalie said. She continued adjusting the drip rate as she spoke. "Recent neuro decline. Pupils reactive but sluggish. O2 sat dropped to 88 during the turn. And this is all you felt necessary to note." His tone carried the particular contempt of someone speaking to a junior high student about advanced calculus. "No contextual observations? No assessment of causation?" The attending ordered routine monitoring. "I documented what the monitoring showed." Mercer turned to the residents. "This is what happens when people work above their credential level. They create documentation that generates questions rather than answering them." He turned back to the chart without looking at Natalie. "Expand your assessment parameters. If you're going to write about patient status, make it meaningful." It was not quite an insult. It was not quite advice. It was a knife with the handle turned toward her, offered as if it were a gift, designed so that taking it would be acknowledging she was wrong. Natalie's jaw tightened a fraction. Her hands remained steady on the fall line. She said nothing. The residents exchanged glances, the kind of look that was not quite smirking but was definitely not sympathetic. This was the rhythm of hierarchy, and Mercer had just established that Natalie occupied the bottom. The message had been delivered in front of witnesses. The message had been received. But that was not the worst part. As Mercer's group moved to the next room, Margaret appeared at Natalie's elbow with a folder. "Dr. Mercer flagged your credentialing file. Standard background refresh. Nothing unusual, but he asked me to review it personally." Margaret's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone uncomfortable with the position she had been put in. "Your prior work experience has some gaps." "I've been transitioning careers," Natalie said. It was true in a way that would not be challenged, because the truth was classified. "Right. Well, just be aware he's going to be watching." Margaret left before Natalie could respond, which was probably wise for both of them. Natalie returned to bed 14, where her real assignment lay unconscious and fighting for every breath. Colonel Bryce had been admitted 3 days ago with pneumonia that had progressed into ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. He had been on the ventilator for 38 hours. His wife had called that morning asking for a prognosis, and Natalie had listened to the fear in her voice and said nothing about the fact that she recognized the colonel's name from her son's deployment records. That she knew he had commanded the 332nd Fighter Squadron out of Baghdad, the same squadron her son had flown with. That knowing this had been the entire reason she had accepted a temporary assignment in Colorado Springs, the reason she was pushing a medication cart instead of training new trauma surgeons at Walter Reed. The colonel lay motionless on the bed, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the ventilator. The monitor displayed his oxygen saturation at 89%, drifting lower despite the high-flow settings. His heart rate was elevated, his blood pressure dropping. He was a strong man. She could see that even in illness, in the set of his shoulders, the build of him, but strength meant nothing against a disease that attacked from inside. Natalie checked his lines, ran her fingers across the foresight for signs of infection, adjusted the monitor leads. She moved with a precision that came from having done these things in conditions far worse than an ICU. Intense without electricity. In the dark. With rounds coming in from miles away. This was clean, this was controlled, this was nearly peaceful by comparison. The Colonel's eyes fluttered. Did not open, but registered movement beneath the lids. Natalie placed her hand briefly on his shoulder. "Your oxygen numbers are good," she said quietly. "You're holding. Stay with us." If he heard her, there was no sign. But the monitor beeped on, steady and present, a signal that at least for this moment, he remained on the living side of the line. Natalie had crossed that line before. She knew how thin it was. She knew how easily people slipped across it when no one was watching closely enough. She would watch closely enough. The shift continued into evening, the light outside the hospital windows turning that particular shade of Colorado gold that came in the space between afternoon and dusk. Natalie completed her rounds methodically, her notes sharp and accurate, her hands never trembling even though somewhere deep in her chest something had begun to tighten. Dr. Mercer had noticed her. He had chosen to establish dominance. That meant he would be watching, which meant every move she made would be scrutinized through the lens of his need to prove her insufficient. The intelligence mission had just become complicated. But complicated was something Natalie had trained for. Complicated was the only thing she had ever trained for. At 8:06 p.m., as she was updating the fall logs, her phone buzzed with a message in a cipher only 3 people in the world could read. It came through a standard hospital paging application, invisible to anyone monitoring her communications. One sentence: "The suppliers meet Thursday. Need confirmation on inventory access." Natalie deleted the message and returned to her work. The Colonel's oxygen saturation had improved to 91%. His heart rate had stabilized. The machines around him continued their mechanical prayer, and Natalie continued her vigil, a quiet nurse in a quiet ward, exactly where she needed to be, exactly where no one thought to look for anything dangerous at all. The grand round started at 6:13 in the morning, when the ICU was still half asleep and coffee hadn't yet worked its way through the attending physician's bloodstreams. Dr. Mercer stood at the foot of bed 7 with Natalie's patient chart held like evidence at a trial, his voice carrying that particular cadence he reserved for moments of pedagogical superiority. 30 residents in white coats arranged themselves in a semicircle, their posture already deferential before he'd spoken a single word. "Gentlemen and lady," he said, glancing briefly at the 2 female residents with an air of afterthought, "I want to discuss what constitutes responsible documentation." He opened the chart. Natalie's chart. She stood at the medication cart on the far side of the unit, drawing up insulin with the same focus she'd applied to field medicine under mortar fire, but her peripheral vision tracked every movement. Observe these nursing notes. 3 days of patient care, and the observations are sparse. Minimalist. Dangerously so. He began reading aloud, his voice pitched for theatrical performance rather than clinical discussion. Patient appears stable. Vitals within parameters. Pain controlled. He looked up over the rim of his glasses. Appears stable? Within parameters? This is the documentation of someone who either lacks the knowledge to articulate what she's observing or the discipline to write it down. The resident smirked. She heard it in the small exhales, the barely suppressed grins. One of them, a third-year named Patterson, actually shifted his weight in a way that telegraphed satisfaction. Natalie didn't look up. Her hand completed the insulin injection with the precision of muscle memory that required no supervision from her conscious mind. 12 years and 4 months of experience had encoded certain movements so deeply that humiliation couldn't interrupt them. Perhaps, Dr. Mercer continued, turning the page with deliberate slowness, we should discuss what minimalist actually means. He smiled at his own observation. It means lazy. It means incomplete. It means a nurse who's more interested in efficiency than in the actual care she's supposed to be providing. The room's fluorescent panels buzzed their mechanical drone overhead. Natalie felt the weight of attention, not supportive, not neutral. Curious in the way people are curious about someone being dismantled. She finished with the insulin, capped the needle, and moved to the next medication without pause. Her jaw had tightened, a barely perceptible tension along the hinge, but her hands remained steady as surgical instruments. Dr. Mercer closed the chart with finality, as if concluding a legal argument. Let this be a reminder that documentation is not a burden. It's a responsibility. Sloppy notes get people killed. He handed the chart back to one of the residents without looking at Natalie. That concludes grand rounds. The semicircle dispersed in the efficient chaos of a teaching hospital, conversations immediately pivoting to patient orders and new admissions. But the damage had its own momentum. Natalie heard Patterson say something to another resident, something about bedside manner versus bedpan management, and watched a smile form on a junior attending's face. She'd been marked. Not as incompetent, but as someone who could be marked. The distinction mattered. The second encounter came at 28 minutes past 9, outside the vending machines on the 4th floor where the lighting was dimmer and foot traffic thinner. Natalie was retrieving water, the same bottled water she retrieved every morning, hydration being non-negotiable in her operational protocol, when Dr. Mercer approached with the specific energy of someone who'd been planning this moment. "Captain," he said. The rank hung in the air like he'd found something strange in a specimen jar. "Or should I just call you Natalie? The captain seems optimistic given your actual qualifications." She turned to face him. The vending machine hummed its mechanical song behind her. The hallway was empty, just the two of them and the inventory of snacks behind glass. "I've been reviewing your employment file," he continued, not waiting for her response. "Minimal credentials. Spotty work history before this position. No references from previous employers." He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd discovered leverage. "I have to wonder what brought you here. What makes a minimally qualified nurse suddenly appear at St. Michael's 6 months ago willing to work nights for substantially below market rate?" Natalie opened the water bottle. Took a measured sip. Her eyes remained level with his. "You know what I think," he pressed on. "I think you're exactly what you appear to be. A nurse who slipped through the credentialing process. Who got lucky. Who should probably stick to what you're actually qualified for." He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not because he was concerned about being overheard. He lowered it for intimacy. For menace. Like bedpans. Or laundry. Something that doesn't require clinical judgment. The water bottle remained at her lips. She didn't flinch. Didn't respond. Didn't even blink. The silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable for him. She could see it register on his face, the frustration of someone accustomed to making people react and encountering instead this absolute refusal to cooperate with his narrative. "I'm only saying this for your own good," he added, and the statement was so transparently false that it almost cracked. Almost. "You're out of your depth here." She lowered the bottle. "Colonel Bryce in bed 14. What's his baseline heart rate this morning?" "Excuse me. You asked about my qualifications. So answer the question." "His baseline heart rate from this morning's rounds." She kept her voice level, conversational even. No defiance, no accusation. Just a simple clinical inquiry delivered with the certainty of someone asking a question she already knew the answer to. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened. "That's not." 72 beats per minute, she continued calmly. "Down from 86 yesterday. His O2 saturation is holding at 96% on 3 liters. His pain medication is effective, but his developing tolerance, I recommend considering rotation to a different opioid class, starting with 5 mg hydromorphone every 6 hours. She paused. His baseline. His vitals. His clinical progression. That's what a qualified nurse documents. That's what a qualified nurse knows. The fluorescent panel above them buzzed louder, or maybe it just seemed that way in the sudden silence. Dr. Mercer's face had flushed. Not dramatically, not in a way designed for audience effect, but with the genuine reddening of someone whose authority had just been directly challenged in a way he couldn't easily dismiss without looking foolish. "You're insubordinate," he said, and his voice had dropped to something harder, sharper. "Continue this pattern and I'll have security escort you out of this hospital. For your own safety and the safety of our patients. Clear?" Natalie held his gaze for 3 seconds. Long enough that the message was unmistakable. She heard him. Long enough that looking away would have been a concession. Then she turned back to the vending machine and pressed the button for another water bottle, a redundant action, meaningless except that it repositioned her back to her original task as if he had never spoken at all. She heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor. Heard them accelerate slightly toward the stairwell, the gait of someone who needed to restore control over something, anything. Then the door swung shut and he was gone. Natalie carried both water bottles back toward the ICU. But the route took her through the supply closet, a narrow space lined with cardboard boxes of sterile gauze, saline bags, and wound dressings. She stepped inside. Closed the door. The darkness was almost complete except for the thin line of hallway light bleeding beneath the door frame. She placed the water bottles on a shelf. Pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving and allowed herself 3 shaking breaths. Just 3. Not from fear. Not from humiliation. But from something older and more dangerous, the precise calibration of restraint required to remain operational when every instinct was demanding immediate and irreversible action. In Baghdad, this kind of restraint had required tactical justification. Orders had come from above, and following orders kept the mission intact and kept her unit alive. Here, the justification was different. The mission was classified. The patient mattered more than Mercer's ego. Colonel Bryce, the man who'd commanded her son's squadron, the man whose Baghdad tours overlapped with her son's deployment by 14 months, was in bed 14 with early septic shock and a prognosis that depended entirely on the precision of her monitoring and intervention. She straightened. Pushed the shelving with enough controlled force that the boxes shifted but nothing fell. 3 breaths had been enough. It was always enough. The ICU received her back without comment. The machines continued their mechanical conversation. The monitors displayed their patterns of light and number. Colonel Bryce lay in bed 14 with his eyes closed and his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of a patient whose body was beginning to struggle against infection even as the antibiotics worked their slow chemistry. She moved to his bedside, checked his for access, confirmed the infusion rate, and reviewed the lab values from the last drawer. Everything was where it needed to be. For now. The night shift had maintained his stability, and she would maintain it through her shift, and whoever came after her would maintain it through theirs. That was the contract of critical care: consistency. Precision. The absolute refusal to let the patients fall through the spaces between moments. She adjusted his blanket. Checked his pulse. Noted the time, 9:37. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer overhead, and Natalie continued her vigil in the quiet unit where no one expected anything dangerous. The ventilator alarm shattered the 3:22 a.m. silence like glass on tile. Natalie heard it from the medication station, that particular pitch, the one that meant something had come loose. Not the normal cycling rhythm. Something wrong with the machine itself. She moved toward bed 14 without thinking about it, the way a person moves toward a sound they've been trained to recognize as danger. Colonel Bryce's oxygen saturation was dropping. The monitor showed it in real time, 94. 91, 87. The numbers falling like a stone down a well. 2 residents had been doing rounds, Winters and Cho, both competent enough in routine situations. Both now standing frozen beside the bed, staring at the monitor as if the numbers might reverse themselves if they looked long enough. Winters's hand hovered near the ventilator. He hadn't touched it. Cho had stepped backward, creating distance between himself and the problem, the universal gesture of someone who didn't know what came next. Natalie was already moving. Step back. Not a request. The words came out in a register Winters and Cho had never heard from her, flat, authoritative, the kind of voice that moved people without explanation. They moved. She didn't check the ventilator readout first. She checked Bryce's chest rise. Uneven. Right side elevated, left side nothing. The clinical picture assembled itself in her mind before her hands touched anything: pneumothorax developing, pressure building, the ventilator forcing air into a space with nowhere for it to go. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Now. Cho moved. Winters still hadn't. The monitor continued its descent: 84. 81, 78. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she said to the silence, already prepping the site with antiseptic that smelled like a field hospital in Kandahar province, that particular chemical bite she'd smelled 1,000 times before. The smell didn't matter. The numbers mattered. 76, 73. 70. Pain was information. Pain was data. She'd learned that in a concrete bunker with mortar rounds walking closer every 5 minutes, learned it from a trauma surgeon named Holloway who'd shown her how to trust her hands when her brain wanted to freeze. Her hands weren't freezing now. The needle went in at the correct angle, through the intercostal space, past the pleura. The hiss of air escaping, that precise sound of pressure releasing, the sound of the pneumothorax decompressing into the atmosphere instead of crushing the lung tissue inside Bryce's chest. O2 saturation, 72. She didn't need to watch it climb. She felt the change in the room's pressure, the shift that happened when crisis became recovery. The air temperature seemed to normalize. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to stop their aggressive buzz. O2, 75. 78, 82. 85, 88. 92, stable. Winters was staring at her hands. They were steady. They had been steady throughout, steady in the way hands get steady when they've done this before, when the muscle memory was deeper than thought. The muscle memory from nights in Baghdad when there wasn't time to be afraid, when fear was the luxury of people who weren't responsible for keeping someone breathing. Get him on supplemental oxygen, Natalie said, already moving to the equipment, her voice back to its measured register, but something different underneath it now, something that had surfaced and couldn't quite be pushed back down. Prepare for chest tube insertion. I want a portable chest X-ray before we move him. Cho had found his voice. Should I call the attending? I am calling the attending. She didn't look at him. But we're already handling it. The words hung there. The clinical precision of them. The authority embedded in the sentence structure. The way she'd said we're already handling it, like the situation had been under her command from the moment the alarm sounded, which, technically, it had been. She'd taken command with a single word: step back. Wintersy's eyes moved from her hands to her face. Looking for something. Looking for the explanation that her composure and her competence and her absolutely correct identification of attention pneumothorax in under 40 seconds seemed to demand. Looking and not finding it, because Natalie Hayes didn't offer explanations. She offered results. The attending, Dr. Rothstein, the one competent physician in the hospital besides Mercer, arrived 7 minutes later. By then the chest X-ray had confirmed the decompression, Colonel Bryce's oxygen saturation had climbed to 96%, and Natalie was already preparing the equipment for the chest tube insertion that would be the definitive treatment. She was moving with absolute precision, the kind of precision that came from having done this under worse conditions, from having done this while incoming fire shook the tent and the patient was coded, and knowing that if you made a single mistake, the man on the table wouldn't get the chance to sit on a porch and drink coffee when this war finally ended. Rothstein looked at the monitor. Looked at the X-ray. Looked at Natalie, who was holding the sterile tray with the chest tube kit and the satin sky clamp and the local anesthetic, ready before he'd even asked for it. What happened? He asked. Ventilator malfunction, Natalie said. Ventilator-associated pneumothorax. I performed needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and administered supplemental oxygen. Saturation is stable. Chest tube is indicated. The clinical language was perfect. Textbook. The kind of thing a trained emergency medicine physician would say, not a floor nurse. Rothstein's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked at Winters. Is that accurate? She was already moving when the alarm went off, Winters said quietly. She knew what it was before she even got to the bed. Knew exactly what to do. Cho was watching Natalie's hands as she prepped the equipment. Watching the way her fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon, the way she anticipated Rothstein's needs before he voiced them, the way she kept one eye on the monitors and one eye on Bryce's color and one eye on the vital signs, like she had 3 sets of eyes and they were all trained on different aspects of the same crisis, all running parallel processing through a system that had been forged in a place where mistakes killed people. Her left wrist caught the light as she reached for gauze. There was a thin line visible there, scar tissue running along the radial artery like a map of a story that didn't belong on the wrist of a nurse who'd been hired 6 months ago through temporary staffing with minimal credentials. Not a tattoo. Not a birthmark. A scar. The kind of scar that came from specific trauma, from shrapnel or a blade, or the kind of wound that got sutured in a field hospital with trembling hands and inadequate lighting. Neither Winters nor Cho asked about it. Neither of them asked about the way she'd identified a problem that 2 residents had missed. Neither of them asked about the clinical precision, or the terminology, or the absolute absence of hesitation in her movements. Neither of them asked because asking would require admitting that they didn't understand what they were looking at. The chest tube insertion took 18 minutes. Rothstein worked with Natalie like they'd been partnered for years, like her hands were extensions of his own surgical intent. She'd anticipated his requests before he voiced them, already handing him the equipment, already adjusting the bed angle, already having the suction ready before the tube was fully placed. When it was done and Bryce's lung was re-expanded and the crisis was codified into medical records and protocols, Rothstein stepped back and looked at Natalie with the same expression Winters had been wearing, the look of someone trying to solve an equation that didn't have enough variables. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You probably just saved his life." Natalie didn't acknowledge the gratitude. She was already moving, already disposing of the sharps, already documenting the procedure in the electronic record with clinical precision. Her jaw was clenched, just barely visible, just a small tension in the line of her profile, but her hands were steady as surgical steel. She'd made the save. She'd shown her hand. She'd demonstrated competence and training and the kind of military-grade composure under pressure that didn't come from nursing school. And she'd done it knowing that Dr. Mercer would find out by morning what happened in his hospital at 3:22 a.m., and that finding out would only deepen his certainty that she was something dangerous, something that didn't fit the institutional structure he'd spent his entire career building. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to everything below them. Dr. Mercer arrived at the ICU at 3:51 a.m., still in his silk pajamas beneath a hastily thrown cardigan, his hair uncombed in a way that made him look smaller than he was. The residents scattered like water from his presence, their voices tripping over each other as they recounted what had happened, the ventilator failure, the patient's oxygen collapse, the nurse who'd moved like she'd done this exact procedure 1,000 times before. One resident mentioned tension pneumothorax and needle decompression and second intercostal space, midclavicular line in the same breath, and Mercer's jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He didn't ask questions. He turned and walked to the hospital administrator's office while it was still dark outside, and by 6:24 a.m., he was on the phone with the state nursing board, his voice composed and professional, not accusing, just concerned. Concerned about credentials. Concerned about a nurse who appeared to have combat medical training that didn't align with her official file. Concerned about protocols being violated. The people on the other end listened because Mercer was the medical director. Because he sounded reasonable. Because he made it sound like a patient safety issue rather than what it actually was, a man whose worldview had just been dismantled by someone in scrubs. By 8:22 a.m., Natalie received notification that she was being reassigned. Pediatric wing. Effective immediately. The email came from Human Resources, but everyone knew whose signature was actually on the decision. Mercer had also adjusted the master schedule. She would now work only evening shifts, opposite the morning rounds where the critical cases were discussed, opposite the nurses who'd watched her save Colonel Bryce's life. Her ICU access was being reviewed pending credential verification. Security protocols. Nothing personal. All perfectly reasonable and completely calculated to isolate her from the only part of this hospital that mattered. She could have fought it. She could have demanded an explanation, filed a complaint, called someone. But every protest would require her to explain how she knew how to perform a needle decompression with the precision of someone who'd done it in a forward operating base outside Fallujah with nothing but a 14-gauge needle and her hand steady under mortar fire. Every objection would lead back to the question, where did you get this training? And answering that question meant admitting she was Captain Natalie Hayes, Air Force Reserve, currently embedded in St. Michael's Hospital on a 3-month undercover assignment to track a medical supply theft ring with connections to the base, a ring that still hadn't been fully exposed, a mission that still needed her here, watching inventory logs and following the chain of diverted medications and equipment that had already disappeared into what the intelligence briefing called a potential national security vulnerability. So she accepted the reassignment with a nod. She cleared her ICU locker in exactly 12 minutes, transferring her personal items into a cardboard box that smelled like old orders and restaurant delivery. Her badge. Her name tag. The small photo of her son in dress uniform from his graduation. And tucked into the lining of her jacket, barely visible unless you knew where to look, the faded unit patch from the 455th Expeditionary Medical Squadron, sewn into the fabric years ago by her own hands during a night shift in a barracks with no electricity. Proof that the person everyone saw as just a nurse had once been something else entirely. She walked out of St. Michael's at 2:13 in the afternoon, and the Colorado Springs afternoon was bright and clear and utterly indifferent to the fact that her carefully constructed world had just collapsed. The intelligence mission. The supply ring. Colonel Bryce, now recovering without her monitoring his vitals anymore. Her son's commanding officer, alive because of her, and now she was gone from the ICU, removed, isolated, neutralized by a man who couldn't tolerate being wrong about anyone in his hospital. The diner on the corner of Nevada and Platt was open at 3:06 a.m. because diners like that always were, and Natalie sat in the back booth with a cup of coffee that had cost $3 and tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous shift. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in the color of old sterile gauze. The vinyl seat was cracked in places, and the rain outside hammered the windows in a rhythm that almost sounded like a heartbeat, or maybe that was just her own pulse, measured and steady even as something inside her had started to feel very small. She stared at her reflection in the coffee's surface, dark, rippling, distorted. Captain Natalie Hayes. 3 tours in Baghdad. 2 Purple Hearts still in a safe deposit box she hadn't looked at in 18 months. 2 silver stars boxed up in her apartment. Hands that had held people together as they died and hands that had killed when necessary and hands that had just gotten reassigned to the pediatric wing where the most critical decision she'd make tomorrow would be whether to apply a cartoon bandage or a plain beige one. The coffee was getting cold. She'd been sitting here for 41 minutes. Her phone showed no messages, no calls. The intelligence coordinator had been briefed that her cover was potentially compromised, and protocols meant radio silence until she could get out clean. No extraction yet. No word from her commanding officer. No indication that anyone at the Pentagon or the Air Force Office of Special Investigations was even aware that Captain Natalie Hayes was currently sitting in a diner at 3 in the morning on the verge of becoming nobody. Maybe Mercer was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe what she'd built, this identity as Natalie the quiet nurse, Natalie the efficient observer, Natalie the person who had learned to take punishment in silence, maybe it was all the mistake he'd suggested it was. She reached into her jacket, felt the edge of the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. 455th Expeditionary Medical Squadron. 312 personnel had rotated through that unit during her first tour. 118 of them had been wounded. 73 had been killed. She'd pronounced 6 of them dead herself. Her hand trembled, and she pulled it back. Soldiers don't cry. She held the trembling in her chest like a secret, like a piece of shrapnel that never quite made it out. The parking lot outside was empty. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. In exactly 2 hours, her shift would start at St. Michael's, the pediatric ward, away from anyone who mattered, away from Colonel Bryce, away from the intelligence mission she'd been running. She could go home. She could call the extraction team and tell them her cover was blown and ask to be pulled. She could walk away from Colorado Springs and from the supply theft ring and from all of it. And then she heard it, distant at first, so distant she almost thought it was thunder. But it wasn't thunder. It was the particular sound of a helicopter rotor beginning to spin up from somewhere on the east side of the city, the sound of a CH-53K King Stallion warming up, the sound of military machinery activating in the middle of an ordinary Colorado night. The sound of someone coming. She didn't know yet what was about to happen. She didn't know that Colonel Bryce had awakened in his hospital bed 36 minutes ago asking for the nurse who'd saved his life. She didn't know that the question, "Where is she?" had been relayed through 3 separate military communication channels. She didn't know that her classified security clearance had triggered an automatic flag in the Pentagon database the moment a hospital credentialing clerk had entered her information into a system that was supposed to stay dormant. But she heard the rotors, and something in her body recognized the sound the way a wolf recognizes the call of the pack. She left a $10 bill on the table for a $3 coffee. She walked out into the rain. And she waited. The rain stopped at 4:24 a.m. Natalie sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, watching the sky shift from black to the color of old concrete. She'd walked out into it 3 hours earlier, soaked through her scrubs, and driven without destination until muscle memory brought her to the employee lot at St. Michael's. The one place she wasn't supposed to be anymore. The one place that mattered. Her phone buzzed. Not a text. A call. The number was Pentagon routing, a 703 area code buried 3 layers deep in classified telecom architecture. Nobody got that number unless somebody very high up had dialed it. Captain Hayes. The voice was male, military precise, no greeting. Your security clearance flag just triggered an automatic inquiry chain. Hospital credentialing database. Looks like someone entered your real information into their system 6 months ago. Flagged routine, but it cascaded to our servers at 4:22 this morning. Natalie's hands didn't move on the steering wheel. The mission. Ongoing. But your cover just became classified government property. Pentagon's initiating full protocols. You have approximately 90 minutes before federal agents walk into that hospital to retrieve you and launch a formal investigation into whatever Dr. Mercer has been doing with his access to your files. The line went dead. She was out of the car before the call fully disconnected, moving toward the main entrance with the kind of speed that looked casual to anyone not trained to recognize a tactical approach. The night shift was rotating out. The building still smelled like antiseptic and the coffee that had been brewing since 11 p.m. She moved through corridors she'd walked 1,000 times, and they felt different now. Like a safe house seconds before the raid. Colonel Bryce was awake in ICU 4, oxygen cannula beneath his nose, monitors displaying the steady reassuring rhythm of a man whose lungs had learned to work again 3 days ago. He'd been asking for her. The nurses on rotation had told her that yesterday before the reassignment took hold. Asking for the quiet one. The competent one. The one Dr. Mercer had called a fraud during rounds. She didn't knock. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, and his eyes found hers immediately with the kind of recognition that came from knowing exactly who you were looking at. Captain. His voice was low, rough from the intubation, but it carried the weight of command. Sir. Mercer came in an hour ago. Started asking about your background. Real aggressive. Then he got a call. Face went the color of old meat. He left without a word, and his hands were shaking. Natalie's breath stayed even. Her shoulders stayed level. He knows. About Baghdad. About the clearance. The Pentagon sending agents in. I have maybe 60 minutes before this facility becomes a federal investigation site. Colonel Bryce looked at the monitors. Then back at her. My squadron, he said. Your boy deployed with us. Sanjin Valley. You kept tabs through my chart. Every update you got from base. Every communication note from visitors. Every single one. He made it back. Last month. On rotation now. Stateside. She paused. Should be here visiting in 4 weeks. The colonel nodded slowly, and something shifted in his expression, the look of a man who understood the weight of what someone was carrying. She's still out there. The woman coordinating the theft network. We were supposed to. I know what we were supposed to do, sir. The door burst open. Dr. Mercer stood in the threshold, his face a mask of controlled rage. Behind him, 2 security guards. One of them was visibly uncomfortable. The other looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Captain, you're off shift. You don't have. I'm going to stop you right there, Doctor. The voice came from the corridor. Marine crisp. The kind of voice that made people move before they understood why. A Marine liaison officer in dress blue stepped past Mercer, and behind him came another officer in an Air Force uniform with insignia that made rank-conscious people's spines straighten. A major. Then, impossibly, a full colonel. The rotation chain was ascending in real time. The medical director of this facility has been making unauthorized inquiries into classified personnel files, the major said, producing a small tablet. Which brings us to this. He began reading from the screen. His voice carried through the open door into the hallway, and nurses stopped walking. Monitors beeped into the sudden silence. Bronze Star. For extraordinary heroism against armed opposition in Baghdad, 2019. He looked up. Looked at Natalie. Looked back at the screen. Second Bronze Star. For actions during a mass casualty incident that saved 4 soldiers and 17 civilians. Another pause. 2 Purple Hearts. Dr. Mercer's face had gone from red to a shade of white that made him look translucent. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. She's just a nurse, I was simply. And, the major continued, his voice dropping lower, making everyone lean in, a Navy Cross. For extraordinary heroism under direct enemy fire while providing medical care to wounded personnel under sustained RPG attack. While conscious of serious wounds to your own body. He set the tablet down. Captain Sandstorm 6. You might know her as the reason half of Charlie Platoon came home. Mercer made a sound like something breaking. He spun toward the security guards. Get her out of here. Get her out. That was when the Air Force colonel stepped forward and saluted. Not a casual gesture. A full, precise, dress uniform salute that made the entire hallway go absolutely still. Captain Hayes. Welcome home. 3 seconds passed. Then footsteps. Heavy boots on tile. Multiple people. FBI windbreakers visible through the windows before the agents actually entered ICU 4. 2 of them, moving with the kind of efficiency that suggested they knew exactly what they were walking into. One carried a tablet. The other carried handcuffs. Dr. Kenneth Mercer. The first agent didn't wait for confirmation. We're here to execute a warrant for your arrest related to federal charges of computer fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and unauthorized access to classified personnel records. You have the right to remain silent. Mercer started talking immediately. Words tumbled out like he could bury the truth under sheer volume. He'd been protecting the hospital. She was a fraud. She'd infiltrated, he'd been trying to, her files showed, he was just trying to verify. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The metal of the handcuffs clicked. A sound like something final. Like a door closing on a chapter that had required her to be less than she was just to survive it. The agent turned to Natalie. Captain, we're going to need a full statement about your placement here and the ongoing operation. There's a secure vehicle waiting. But first, he paused, checked a piece of paper. Your son. Captain James Hayes. He's en route to this location. ETA 18 minutes. Your command has authorized emergency family leave given the circumstances. Natalie felt something in her chest shift. Something she'd been holding for 6 months finally unclenching. 18 minutes. He was in Colorado Springs for briefings. When Pentagon protocols went live, they contacted him. Cleared him to come here rather than send you to a debrief site. 6 months. 18 minutes away now. The FBI agents were escorting Mercer out of the room. He was still talking, his voice getting higher, more frantic. His medical director's ID badge swinging from his neck like an accusation. The nurses in the hallway parted to let them through, their faces a study in silent vindication. All of them had known something was wrong. The competent one didn't make mistakes. The competent one didn't accept insults from people who'd never saved a life under enemy fire. Colonel Bryce watched from his bed, oxygen saturation steady at 98%. Your son know what you are? Not yet. His clearance doesn't go high enough. But soon. Natalie adjusted the unit patch that was still hidden inside her jacket lining, the faded patch from her first deployment, sewn so carefully that nobody had ever noticed it. She could see it now when she changed at home. Had looked at it 1,000 times in the diner at 3 a.m., wondering if she was allowed to be both things at once. A nurse. A soldier. A mother. I'm going to tell him everything. The Air Force colonel was still in the hallway. Natalie stepped out to meet him. His rank made him someone superior. Someone important. But his eyes held something else, recognition of the kind that transcended hierarchy. Captain, you're being offered immediate reinstatement to active duty with option to request reassignment. Or, he paused. The hospital board is pushing hard for you to stay. Apparently word's gotten out about why you actually saved Colonel Bryce. They want to create a formal position. Director of Emergency Medicine with Trauma Specialization. Full captain's pay, kept on classified reserve status for ongoing operations. Natalie looked back through the window into ICU 4. At the colonel lying there with his oxygen saturation stable and his eyes clear. At the monitor displaying a heartbeat that hadn't existed 3 days ago except for the electricity running through his body at her hands. I'll need to talk to my son first, she said. But I think I know where I belong. 6 months later, Natalie adjusted her scrubs and pulled on her white coat. The unit patch was sewn visibly now, on the outside of her jacket lining, in the same place it had been hidden, except nobody had to guess at what it meant anymore. Captain. Air Force. Combat medic. Just a nurse who'd saved lives in the worst places on Earth and had decided to keep saving them in Colorado Springs. The news report played on the break room television without sound. She caught the footage halfway through. Dr. Mercer in an open-sided uniform that said he community college CPR instructor teaching chest compressions to disinterested adults in a fluorescent-lit room in Tucson. His face had aged 5 years in 6 months. His hands trembled when he demonstrated the motions. When a student called him doctor, he flinched like the word was an accusation. The rest of the story scrolled beneath: federal sentencing pending, medical license suspended, $847,000 in kickback payments seized from offshore accounts, conspiracy charges with 7 members of the vendor network. The hospital had announced new protocols. A full VA trauma wing funded by the settlement from Mercer's case. Pro bono veteran care. A standing consultation position for military medical personnel who'd transitioned to civilian care. Her son was waiting in her office when she got downstairs. Captain James Hayes, Air Force, San Gin Valley, alive and whole and sitting in a chair meant for administrative business he'd clearly decided was unimportant. He stood when she came in, and the military posture fell away into something that looked like 17 years of not knowing and now knowing everything at once. Mom. The word carried the weight of 6 months of classified conversations and newly cleared briefing files and finally understanding why she'd disappeared for 3 years when he was deployed. Why she'd needed to be invisible. Why power had never come from titles but from hands that knew how to hold people together when the world was trying to tear them apart. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. She hugged her son with a kind of pressure that meant she'd held him from 3,000 miles away every single day, and now she could finally hold him in person without apology. "I go back to San Diego in 4 weeks," he said into her shoulder. "But I'm taking the entire month first." "You're not working it." "I have shifts scheduled." "Not anymore." "I called the hospital administrator personally." Pulled rank. "Very proud of myself for remembering I could do that." He pulled back, just enough to look at her. "They said you were already trying to give up the days. That you'd been planning to volunteer at the free clinic instead." The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. For years of restraint. 6 months of underground. A lifetime of being smaller than she was so that other people's egos could feel bigger. 18 years of single parenting while carrying classified information in a locked compartment of her heart. All of it finally released. "There's someone I want you to meet," James said. "The Colonel. Your patient. He's in the waiting room. Brought his entire squadron. They're all here. They wanted to say thank you." Natalie stepped back into the hallway. Down toward the waiting area, where decorated officers in dress blue stood and came to attention when they saw her. Where Colonel Bryce, oxygen-free now, extended his hand with the kind of grip that meant respect earned not from a uniform but from what she'd done with the knowledge she carried. "Captain Hayes," he said simply. "Welcome home." She was back in scrubs by morning shift. Back in the ICU checking vitals on patients nobody else wanted to monitor. Back doing the work that had never required a title to matter. The unit patch visible on her jacket now, not hidden anymore. Not apologized for anymore. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors we walk past every day. Like and comment if you had to choose between a secret that protected lives and a secret that protected your pride, which would you choose?